Sarah Mitchell stepped into the gleaming expanse of Elite Motors in New York City on a crisp April morning in 2025, the kind of day where the sun filtered through Manhattan's towering skyscrapers and cast a golden glow over the bustling streets below. The dealership's massive glass walls reflected the chaotic symphony of taxis honking and pedestrians rushing, while inside, an array of luxury cars stood like silent sentinels of wealth: Porsches, Lamborghinis, Bentleys, each polished to a mirror-like sheen, their sleek curves catching the light in a way that screamed exclusivity and power. At 38, Sarah wore a pair of faded jeans with frayed hems and a plain gray t-shirt, the fabric slightly worn from years of use, bearing the faint imprint of a laundry detergent scent rather than any designer label. Her blonde hair was pulled back into a low ponytail that swayed gently with each step, and her face bore no trace of makeup, leaving her hazel eyes and the faint freckles across her nose as the only accents to her appearance. She carried no purse, no jewelry, nothing to signal the kind of affluence typically associated with a place like this. Yet her eyes held a quiet confidence, a steadiness that came from years of knowing exactly who she was and what she valued, a confidence that didn't need the crutch of designer labels or ostentatious displays to stand firm. She had come with a singular purpose: to find the perfect gift for her brother David's 45th birthday, a milestone made all the more precious by his recent victory over a grueling illness that had kept him tethered to hospital beds and 4 drips for months. In her mind, she pictured David behind the wheel of a car he'd always dreamed of owning, his broad grin lighting up his weathered face as he gripped the steering wheel, his calloused hands, rough from years of manual labor, finally touching something extraordinary. It would be a reward for the resilience he'd shown through countless rounds of chemotherapy, sleepless nights filled with pain, and the quiet determination that had carried him back to health. That image had propelled her out of bed that morning, past the comfort of her quiet home on the outskirts of the city, where the trees whispered in the wind and the chaos of Manhattan felt a world away. She'd driven into the heart of the city, her old Toyota humming along the highways, and now stood in the showroom of Elite Motors, her heart beating with a flicker of excitement at the thought of surprising David with something he'd never expect. The night before, she'd sat at her kitchen table, a mug of chamomile tea cooling beside her as she scrolled through Elite Motors' website on her laptop. Her finger had paused on the image of a striking red sports car, the Crimson Velocity, priced at $270,000. Its bold finish and sleek design had struck her as perfect for David, a symbol of the strength and passion he'd rediscovered after staring death in the face. She'd imagined the roar of its engine echoing through the quiet streets of their childhood neighborhood, the way David's eyes would widen with that boyish excitement he'd always had for cars, even as a kid when he'd drag her to local car shows and ramble on about horsepower and torque until she'd tune him out with a laugh. Now, standing in the showroom, she felt that vision solidify. The Crimson Velocity gleamed under the lights, its red paint shimmering like liquid fire, and she could almost hear David's voice in her ear, teasing her for finally understanding his obsession. Elite Motors was no ordinary dealership. Nestled in the pulsing core of Manhattan, where the air buzzed with ambition and the sidewalks thrummed with the footsteps of the powerful and the privileged, it catered to a clientele accustomed to luxury as a birthright. The showroom smelled faintly of leather and expensive cologne, a scent that lingered in the air like a signature of wealth, mingling with the subtle undertone of wax polish used to keep the cars pristine. Soft classical music, perhaps Mozart or Chopin, floated through the space, creating an atmosphere that felt more like a private club than a place of commerce. The marble floors gleamed under recessed lighting, and the cars were arranged with surgical precision, each one elevated on a platform or angled just so to maximize its allure, their chrome accents winking like stars against the glossy black backdrop of the showroom walls. As Sarah pushed through the heavy glass doors, she felt the shift immediately. The cool blast of air conditioning hit her skin, chilling the faint sweat that had gathered on her brow from the walkover from the parking garage. But it was the weight of scrutinizing gazes that truly registered, pressing against her like an invisible force. A woman in a red designer dress clicked past in high heels, her perfume trailing like a declaration of status, sharp and floral, cutting through the air. Two employees near the reception desk, clad in crisp black suits with name tags pinned neatly to their lapels, exchanged a glance as they took in Sarah's scuffed sneakers and lack of ostentation. Their lips curled into smirks, and they whispered something to each other, their amusement barely concealed behind their hands, as if her presence were a minor disruption to their carefully curated world, a world where appearances were everything, where the cut of your clothes and the brand of your watch determined your worth before you even opened your mouth. Sarah noticed, of course. She wasn't oblivious, but she didn't let it faze her. She'd spent too many years building something meaningful to care about the shallow judgments of strangers. James Carter, the sales manager, stood beside the crimson Velocity, adjusting the cufflinks on his tailored gray suit with a flick of his wrist. At 42, he cut an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, with jet-black hair slicked back and a navy tie knotted with precision, the kind of knot that took practice to perfect. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room with the practiced ease of a predator sizing up prey, missing nothing. He prided himself on his ability to read customers in an instant, a skill honed over a decade in the luxury car business, where every sale was a chess move and every client a potential checkmate. To James, every detail mattered, the cut of a suit, the gleam of a watch, the confidence in a handshake, even the way someone carried themselves as they crossed the threshold. These were the markers of serious buyers, the kind who didn't blink at six-figure price tags, the kind who kept his commission checks fat and his reputation intact among the elite circles he moved in. He thrived on the thrill of the sale, the adrenaline rush of closing a deal worth more than most people's annual salaries, the satisfaction of watching a client drive off in a machine that screamed success. When his gaze landed on Sarah, he paused, his head tilting slightly as he took in her faded jeans, her plain t-shirt, her complete lack of anything that screamed money, or even hinted at it. A slow, mocking smile spread across his face, and he nodded subtly to a colleague nearby, a silent signal that something entertaining was about to unfold. Sarah barely noticed the undercurrent of judgment swirling around her like a gathering storm. Her attention was fixed on the crimson Velocity, its bold red finish glinting under the showroom lights like a flame frozen in time, a beacon amid the sea of chrome and glass. Up close, it was even more striking than it had been on her laptop screen, the curves of its body sleek and aerodynamic, the grille aggressive yet elegant, the promise of speed and power radiating from every inch like a living thing. She could already imagine David running his hand along its hood, his eyes lighting up with that boyish excitement he'd always had, the way he'd turn to her and say, "You didn't have to do this, sis," even as his grin betrayed his delight. "Hello," she said, her voice soft but clear as a young salesman named Liam approached. Liam, barely 25, wore a suit that hung slightly loose on his lanky frame, his brown hair tousled as if he'd run his hands through it one too many times out of nervous habit. He offered a shy smile, his hands fidgeting slightly at his sides, his posture awkward but earnest. "Welcome to Elite Motors. I'm Liam. Is there something specific you're interested in today?" His tone was genuine, a stark contrast to the polished arrogance that seemed to permeate the room, and Sarah felt a small wave of relief at his approach. Before she could respond, James swooped in, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor with a rhythm that exuded authority, each step deliberate and commanding. "I'll handle this, Liam," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the weight of command, leaving no room for argument. He turned to Sarah, his smile tight and insincere, his eyes raking over her with thinly veiled disdain, lingering on her sneakers, her jeans, her lack of anything remotely luxurious. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" The question dripped with condescension, as if her very presence were an affront to the sanctity of his domain, a blemish on the perfection he strove to maintain. Sarah didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her expression calm and unshaken, and pointed to the crimson Velocity with a steady hand. "Actually, I'm interested in that car. I'd like to know more about it." James's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before it hardened into something closer to a grimace. He'd seen this before, people wandering in off the street, drawn by the allure of machines they could never afford, wasting his time with idle questions and empty wallets. With end-of-month quotas looming and 3 high-profile clients scheduled for the afternoon, clients who'd already emailed their preferences and budget ranges, each one a guaranteed sale if he played his cards right, he had no patience for dreamers like her. "That's the Crimson Velocity," he said, his voice deliberately slow, as if speaking to someone who couldn't possibly comprehend the gravity of what stood before her. "A limited edition, only 20 made this year. Perhaps I could direct you to our used car lot a few blocks away." He gestured toward the exit with a sweep of his hand, his tone dismissive, already mentally ushering her out the door, his mind racing ahead to the Petersons and the commission they'd bring. Sarah caught the way his eyes lingered on her worn sneakers, the frayed hems of her jeans, the absence of any brand name on her t-shirt. She was used to it, the quick judgments, the assumptions that her appearance told the whole story, the way people's eyes narrowed as if trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit. Despite her personal wealth, earned through the Mitchell Autism Support Foundation, which she'd built from nothing before meeting her husband, Edward, Sarah chose simplicity. She found freedom in it, a way to stay grounded amid a life that could easily have been consumed by extravagance. The foundation was her life's work, born from her childhood memories of watching her cousin struggle with autism in a world that offered little help, a world that dismissed him as different rather than seeing the brilliance beneath his silence. Over the years, she'd raised over $40 million to provide resources, therapy, education, community, for children who needed it most, children whose parents wrote her tearful letters of gratitude she kept in a box under her bed. But none of that was visible in her faded jeans, and she preferred it that way. "I'd really like to learn more about this one," she said, her politeness unwavering, her voice steady despite the subtle hostility in James's stance, the way he shifted his weight as if preparing to physically block her path. "Is it possible to see the interior?" James's expression soured, his lips pressing into a thin line, his patience visibly fraying. Behind him, 2 salesmen exchanged knowing looks, their amusement palpable, their shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter as they watched their boss prepare to dismantle yet another time-waster. "The Crimson Velocity is by appointment only," he lied effortlessly, his voice clipped and final, the words rolling off his tongue with the ease of a well-rehearsed script. "Our serious clients schedule private viewings." It was a fabrication, one he'd used before to weed out those he deemed unworthy, and he delivered it with the confidence of someone who'd never been called out, his arms crossing over his chest as if daring her to argue. Sarah Mitchell stood her ground in the polished expanse of Elite Motors, the air thick with the faint hum of classical music and the sharper edge of James Carter's disdain. His lie about the Crimson Velocity being appointment only hung between them, a flimsy shield for his prejudice, but she didn't call it out, not yet. She tilted her head slightly, her hazel eyes steady on his, and repeated her request with the same calm persistence that had carried her through years of building the Mitchell Autism Support Foundation from a dream into a reality. "I'd really like to see the interior," she said, her voice soft but unwavering, cutting through the tension like a quiet stream through stone. "I'm serious about buying it." James's lips pressed tighter, his patience fraying visibly now, the corners of his mouth twitching as if suppressing a sneer. Behind him, The two salesmen who'd been watching the exchange snickered openly, their laughter a low rumble that rolled across the showroom, drawing the attention of a few browsing customers who turned to stare. James stepped closer, his broad frame looming over her, his polished shoes gleaming against the marble floor. "Look," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, though it carried enough to ensure the onlookers could hear, "I've seen people like you before. You come in here, gawking at things you can't afford, wasting everyone's time." His blue eyes flicked over her faded jeans and scuffed sneakers again, his judgment as sharp as a blade. "This is a business, not a museum. The Crimson Velocity isn't for daydreamers." Sarah felt the heat rise to her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from a slow-building anger that simmered beneath her calm exterior. She'd faced this kind of dismissal before, in boardrooms where men in suits assumed her quiet demeanor meant she lacked authority, in meetings where her ideas were overlooked until someone louder claimed them. But this was different, more public, more deliberate, a spectacle designed to shame her into retreat. "I'm not daydreaming," she said, her tone still even, though a faint edge crept into it now. "I'm prepared to pay cash for it today." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the silence that followed. Liam, the young salesman hovering nearby, widened his eyes, his hands twisting together as if unsure whether to step in or flee. The two salesmen behind James froze, their smirks faltering, while a woman in a fur coat browsing a nearby Porsche turned fully to watch, her eyebrows arching with curiosity. For a moment, James seemed caught off guard, his confident facade cracking just enough to reveal a flicker of doubt. But then he laughed, a sharp, harsh sound that echoed through the showroom, shattering the tension and replacing it with something uglier. "Cash? Really?" he said, his voice rising deliberately, turning the moment into a performance for the growing audience. "This isn't a flea market, lady. We're talking $270,000. People who can afford these cars don't dress like." He waved a hand at her outfit, letting the gesture finish his thought, his sneer cutting deeper than his words, his arms crossing over his chest as if daring her to prove him wrong. The showroom fell silent, the classical music fading into a distant hum beneath the weight of his mockery. Customers paused mid-conversation, sales staff froze, and Liam shuffled his feet, his face flushed with second-hand embarrassment. Sarah felt the heat in her cheeks intensify, her pulse quickening, but it wasn't shame driving it, it was anger, not for herself, but for everyone who'd ever been belittled like this, judged and discarded based on nothing more than their appearance. She opened her mouth to respond, to say that her money was as green as anyone's, that she'd written checks larger than this for her foundation without blinking, but before she could, a new voice cut through the air. "Is there a problem here?" Michael Evans, the owner of Elite Motors, emerged from his office at the back of the showroom, drawn by the rising commotion. A man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a navy suit that screamed bespoke tailoring, he carried himself with the easy authority of someone who'd built this empire from the ground up. His brown eyes assessed the scene with a practiced sweep, taking in Sarah's unassuming figure, James's towering stance, and the small crowd of onlookers now watching with rapt attention. James straightened, his confidence surging back as he sensed an ally. "No problem, sir," he said, his tone smooth now, laced with the deference he reserved for authority. "Just explaining to this lady that we operate by appointment for serious buyers. She's been asking about the Crimson Velocity, but," he shrugged, leaving the implication hanging, "she doesn't belong here." Michael turned to Sarah, his smile thin and professional, though his eyes mirrored James's skepticism as they lingered on her faded t-shirt. "And you are?" he asked, his voice polite but carrying an undercurrent of dismissal. "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, her voice steady despite the humiliation burning in her chest, her hands clasped in front of her to keep them from trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of holding her composure. "Miss Mitchell," Michael said, his smile tightening, "perhaps there's a misunderstanding. Our clientele typically, well, they understand the exclusivity of our vehicles. We cater to a certain standard." The words were a velvet glove over a steel fist, a polite way of echoing James's disdain. Sarah met his gaze, her hazel eyes unwavering. "I understand perfectly," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through the pretense. "Your sales manager has made your policies very clear." James seized the opening, stepping forward again, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you're genuinely interested, which I doubt, call and make an appointment. Bring proof of funds and dress the part. These cars," he said, sweeping an arm around the showroom, "are for a certain class of people." A snicker rippled through the onlookers, the woman in the fur coat, a salesman adjusting his tie, a couple near a Bentley who'd stopped to watch. Sarah's stomach twisted, not from their laughter, but from the realization of how deeply entrenched this mindset was, how easily it was accepted here. She'd faced discrimination before, subtle slights, dismissive glances, but rarely so blatantly, so publicly, with an audience egging it on. "Is that your policy?" she asked Michael, turning her attention to him, giving him a chance to intervene, to prove this wasn't the dealership's ethos. But Michael's expression remained impassive, his hands slipping into his pockets as he shrugged lightly. "We do prioritize our established clients," he said, his tone evasive, his eyes avoiding hers now. "I'm sure you understand." It was tacit approval of James's behavior, a refusal to challenge the status quo. James smirked, emboldened. "Like I said," he muttered, not quite under his breath, "some people don't know their place." The words landed like a slap, and for the first time, Sarah's composure wavered, her lips pressing into a thin line. She looked around, at James's smug grin, Michael's detached indifference, the judging faces of the onlookers, and felt the weight of their collective dismissal settle over her like a shroud. She could have fought back. She could have pulled out her phone, called her bank, and had a statement emailed within minutes proving she could buy the Crimson Velocity twice over. She could have mentioned the Mitchell Foundation, the $40 million she'd raised, the lives she'd changed. But she didn't. Not because she couldn't, but because she refused to reduce her worth to a performance for their validation. "I see," she said simply, her voice steady despite the storm inside her. With her dignity intact but her spirit bruised, she turned and walked toward the exit, her sneakers silent against the marble, the glass doors looming ahead like a portal back to a world that didn't measure her by her clothes. As they closed behind her, she heard James's voice drift through the crack, not quite quiet enough, "Good riddance." Outside, the Manhattan sunlight hit her face, warm and unrelenting, easing the sting of the encounter as it washed over her skin. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the city's pulse, honking horns, chattering voices, swirling around her, grounding her. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her fingers brushing the worn denim, and dialed home. The humiliation still burned, a tight knot in her chest, but a small, resolute smile formed on her lips as the call connected. Edward Mitchell, her husband, picked up on the second ring, his deep voice a familiar anchor. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, sensing something in her silence. "I'm coming home," she said, her tone even but heavy. "We need to talk." The drive back to their estate on New York's outskirts was a blur, highways blending into tree-lined roads, the hum of her old Toyota a steady companion to her thoughts. The house sat on 10 acres of quiet land, a sprawling but understated structure of stone and glass surrounded by oaks and maples, its elegance subtle rather than ostentatious. Edward preferred it that way. At 41, he was a billionaire in artificial intelligence, a visionary who'd revolutionized machine learning with quiet determination, building a fortune while shunning the spotlight that came with it. When Sarah stepped into his study, he looked up from his desk, his green eyes narrowing as he took in her expression. Papers were scattered across the oak surface, a laptop glowing faintly, but he pushed them aside, rising to meet her. After 12 years of marriage, he could read her like an open book, every flicker of her brow, every tightening of her jaw. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and steady, crossing the room to stand beside her. Sarah sank into a leather chair near the window, the afternoon light spilling over her, casting soft shadows across her face. "It was educational," she said, a wry smile tugging at her lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. She recounted the experience at Elite Motors, the condescension from James, the complicity of Michael, the blatant discrimination that had unfolded in front of a smirking crowd. As she spoke, Edward's expression darkened, his jaw tightening, his hands clenching into fists at his sides, though he remained silent, giving her space to process. "They treated me like I was nothing," she said, her voice dropping, "because I didn't look the part. And the worst part? They didn't even hesitate." She paused, staring out at the trees swaying in the breeze. "It's not about me. I can walk away knowing the truth. But how many people get treated like that every day, with no way to push back?" Edward nodded, settling into the chair across from her, his elbows resting on his knees as he leaned forward. "You're right," he said, his voice a quiet rumble. "It's bigger than just you." He'd always admired this about her, her ability to see beyond herself, to turn personal slights into a call for something greater. "So what do you want to do about it?" Sarah sighed, running a hand through her ponytail, loosening a few strands. "Part of me wants to do nothing," she admitted. "Just buy David's gift somewhere else and forget it. But then I think about that young salesman, Liam, who treated me with respect, even when no one else did. And I think about all the people who don't have the privilege I do, who can't just shrug it off." She looked at Edward, her eyes sharpening with resolve. "They need to understand that worth isn't tied to how you look. But I don't want revenge. I want them to see." Edward's lips curved into a faint smile, a spark lighting his eyes. "I think I have an idea," he said, leaning back now, his mind already turning. "Nothing too dramatic, don't worry," he added, catching the warning look she shot him. Sarah knew his protective streak, the way he'd once threatened to buy out a company that had stiffed her foundation on a grant, only relenting when she'd talked him down. "No buying the dealership and firing everyone," she teased, her tone lightening for the first time since she'd walked in. He chuckled, a deep, warm sound that filled the room. "Nothing so cliché. But maybe a little education is in order, something that sticks." Together, they began to craft a plan, not for vengeance, but for enlightenment, a way to shift perspectives without breaking spirits. As evening settled over the estate, the sky bruising purple beyond the windows, Edward made several phone calls, his voice low and authoritative as he set things in motion. Sarah sat nearby, sipping tea, her mind still replaying the day's events but now tempered by a growing sense of purpose. Tomorrow, Elite Motors would face a reckoning, not with anger, but with a lesson they wouldn't soon forget. The next morning, April's sunlight streamed into Manhattan, illuminating Elite Motors as a black Bentley Continental GT, worth over $1.2 million, rolled to a stop outside the showroom at 10:17 a.m. Its custom finish shimmered, silencing the hum of the dealership. James Carter, the sales manager, straightened his navy tie, his pulse quickening at the sight. He'd just finished a staff meeting, stressing the need to qualify customers efficiently, his anecdote about dismissing Sarah Mitchell the previous day still fresh from drinks with colleagues. Now, sensing a big sale, he strode toward the entrance, his shoes clicking on marble. A chauffeur opened the Bentley's rear door, revealing Edward Mitchell, a tall man in a tailored suit, his salt and pepper hair groomed, his green eyes unreadable. At 41, the AI billionaire exuded quiet authority. "Good morning, sir." James Carter, sales manager, James greeted, extending a hand with a wide smile. Edward shook it firmly. "Edward Mitchell," he said simply. James, not placing the name but dazzled by the car, pressed on. "What brings you here?" "We've got new arrivals," Edward cut him off. "I'm here about the Crimson Velocity, Midnight Red." James beamed. "Excellent choice, one of 20 made this year." "It's right, I know where it is," Edward interrupted. "My wife was here yesterday, interested in it." James faltered. "Your wife?" "Sarah Mitchell," Edward said, his tone cooling. "Jeans, white t-shirt. You told her to try used cars." James's smile vanished as realization hit. Sarah, the woman he'd mocked, tied to this man. "Mr. Mitchell, there's a misunderstanding," he stammered. Michael Evans, the owner, approached, sensing tension. "Everything all right?" he asked, offering a hand. Michael Evans. Edward shook it. "I was telling Mr. Carter my wife was treated poorly here yesterday, wanting the Crimson Velocity for her brother." Michael frowned. "I'm sorry, I wasn't fully aware, she was told she didn't belong," Edward said firmly, "based on her clothes." The showroom hushed, staff and customers watching. James, desperate, said, "If there was a mix-up, it wasn't." Liam, the young salesman, interjected, stepping forward. "She was polite, specific, and dismissed for her appearance." James glared, but Liam held his ground. Edward faced Michael. "My wife runs the Mitchell Autism Support Foundation, raised $40 million for kids. She dresses simply to stay connected to them. That's why I love her." Michael paled, James slumped. "Your actions show your values," Edward added. "I plan to buy the Crimson Velocity and a 7-car fleet, but now I'm unsure about this place." Michael jumped in. "Mr. Mitchell, I apologize, we'll fix this," Edward nodded. "Maybe. But it's more than cars. Our gala next month needs volunteers. Mr. Carter, you'd learn something there." James swallowed. "Sir?" "Not as a guest, as staff," Edward said. "And your dealership should train on bias." Michael agreed quickly. "Absolutely." Edward turned to Liam. "You'll handle the Crimson Velocity sale." Liam blinked. "Me? Thank you, sir." Edward smiled faintly. "Let's discuss the fleet," he said to Michael, pausing by the car. "Sarah has great taste." James stood frozen, his world shaken, realizing he'd judged the wrong person. A month later, the New York Metropolitan Hotel's ballroom glowed for the Mitchell Autism Support Foundation Gala, raising funds for a therapy center. Chandeliers lit tables with auction items, including a Crimson Velocity model from Elite Motors. Families, donors, and kids with autism filled the space with chatter and laughter. James Carter stood near the entrance in a black polo and khakis, a James Volunteer tag on his chest. His slick hair was mussed, his blue eyes scanning the room. He'd started this as a forced duty after Edward's ultimatum, his pride stinging from the showroom incident. But weeks of helping at the foundation, moving chairs, sorting donations, watching kids, had begun to shift something in him. He adjusted a basketball hoop for Emma, a 10-year-old in a wheelchair, her curls bouncing as she directed him. "Lower, Mr. James," she said. He knelt, tweaking it. "Like this?" "Perfect," she grinned. He smiled back, a rare softness in his face. Volunteering had been grudging at first, he'd counted days, resenting Sarah and Edward. But Emma's energy, a boy's pride in a new word, and parents' gratitude had cracked his defenses. He'd begun to see what Sarah meant about worth beyond looks. Sarah, in a simple blue dress, moved through the crowd, her blonde hair loose, chatting with a boy about his toy car. Edward, in a suit, watched her with pride, his hand on her shoulder. "He's doing well," he murmured, nodding at James. "It's what he learns that matters," she replied. They'd debated this step, but Sarah wanted understanding, not punishment. James, now helping Emma, was far from the man who'd sneered at her. Later, Sarah approached him as he fixed a table. "How's it going?" she asked. He paused, serious. "Humbling. Necessary." She nodded. "Thomas likes you," she said, glancing at a boy nearby. "He's teaching me basketball," James admitted. "I'm terrible." She laughed, and he grew earnest. "Mrs. Mitchell, I'm sorry, truly, for how I treated you." She met his gaze. "There's no excuse, but what have you learned?" "Worth isn't appearance or status," he said. "Everyone deserves respect first." "Good lessons," she said. "Expensive ones," he added, thinking of lost sales. "Worth it," he replied. Edward joined them, surprising James. "I hear you're into adaptive sports now," he said. "Yes, sir," James said. "I'll keep volunteering, and we're changing how we treat customers at Elite Motors." Edward nodded. "Good. That fleet we mentioned, we're still in the market. Handle it?" James blinked, grateful. "I'd be honored." Later, as the gala wound down, he helped Emma with a photo, her grin warm. "You're cool, Mr. James," she said. He smiled. "Coming from you, that's big." His view had shifted, true value lay beyond labels, a lesson he'd carry forward. Weeks after the gala, James Carter sat in his office at Elite Motors, the late May sunlight filtering through the blinds, casting stripes across his desk. The gray suit and navy tie were back, but the man wearing them felt different. His once impenetrable confidence had softened, replaced by a quieter certainty born from the past month's lessons. The showroom beyond his door hummed with its usual rhythm, sales staff pitching, engines purring, but James's focus was on a stack of training manuals titled Unconscious Bias in Customer Service, a program he'd spearheaded with Michael Evans's approval. It was a direct result of Edward Mitchell's suggestion, and James had thrown himself into it, determined to reshape how Elite Motors treated its clients. No more snap judgments based on clothes or demeanor, every customer would get a fair shot, a policy he'd once scoffed at but now championed. He leaned back in his chair, his blue eyes drifting to a photo on his desk, not of a car or a sales award, but of him and Emma from the gala, her wheelchair angled beside him as they grinned over a basketball prop. That night had changed him more than he'd expected. Volunteering had started as a penalty, a way to save his job after dismissing Sarah Mitchell, but it had become something else. He'd signed up for more shifts at the Mitchell Foundation, coaching adaptive basketball with kids like Emma and Thomas, their laughter and resilience teaching him what worth really meant. He'd misjudged Sarah, assuming her jeans and t-shirt marked her as insignificant, but her work, $40 million raised for kids with autism, had humbled him. He'd learned to look deeper, a lesson he now carried into every interaction. Downstairs, Liam approached a customer in a hoodie with the same enthusiasm he'd shown Sarah, his oversized suit replaced by one that fit, a quiet confidence in his step. James had taken him under his wing, mentoring him since Edward assigned him the Crimson Velocity sale. "You've got a good eye," James told him one day, reviewing a sale Liam had closed. "Keep treating everyone like they matter, because they do." Liam nodded, grateful, and James saw a younger version of himself in him, one he hoped would avoid his old mistakes. The dealership's numbers were climbing again, bolstered by Edward's eventual fleet purchase, 7 corporate vehicles plus the Crimson Velocity, proof that integrity could pay off. Meanwhile, at the Mitchell estate, Sarah and Edward sat on their porch, the evening air cool against their skin. The gala had raised enough for the therapy center, and Sarah sipped tea, her blue dress swapped for jeans and a sweater, her blonde hair loose. "It worked," she said, glancing at Edward, his green eyes warm in the fading light. James learned something. Edward smiled, his hand finding hers. "You were right, education, not revenge." They'd watched James transform at the gala, his apology to Sarah sincere, his offer to keep volunteering a sign of real change. The fleet deal had sealed it, a reward for his growth, but Sarah cared more about the ripple effect, how one man's shift could influence others. The next day, David Mitchell pulled into their driveway, his weathered pickup rattling to a stop. Sarah had invited him over, keeping the surprise under wraps. "What's this about?" he asked, stepping out, his broad frame still lean from months of illness, his grin curious. Sarah led him to the garage, Edward trailing behind, and pulled open the door. There stood the Crimson Velocity, its red finish gleaming under the lights, a bow on its hood. David's jaw dropped, his hazel eyes, so like Sarah's, widening. "No way," he breathed, running a hand along its curves, his voice thick. "Sis, you didn't." "I did," she said, smiling. "For your birthday. You deserve it." He circled the car, touching the grille, the leather seats, his excitement bubbling up. "This is insane," he said, laughing, a sound that echoed with the joy she'd hoped for. Edward clapped him on the shoulder. She picked it out, fought for it, too. David turned to her, pulling her into a hug. "You're nuts, but I love you." They spent the afternoon driving it, David behind the wheel, Sarah beside him, Edward in the back, through the winding roads near the estate, the engines roar a soundtrack to their laughter. Back home, over coffee, David recounted the ride, his hands gesturing wildly, and Sarah felt a quiet triumph, not just for the gift, but for the journey that led here. James, too, reflected that night, driving home from Elite Motors. A month ago, he'd have dismissed Sarah based on her genes, blind to her strength. Now, he saw value in the overlooked, Emma's grin, Liam's potential, Sarah's resolve. As he passed a billboard for the foundation, he smiled faintly. True wealth wasn't in his bank account, but in how he treated those he'd once ignored, a lesson worth every penny.